Our third text that attempts to answer the question, what is poetry, is Percy Bysshe Shelley's A Defense of Poetry. In this, we'll be able to see some similarities to Wordsworth and Coleridge, but also some significant differences. This essay was provoked by a work written by Shelley's friend, Thomas Love Peacock, entitled The Four Ages of Poetry. As the note in your textbook explains, Peacock divided poetry into 4 ages, and showing how it evolves through different societies, growing and declining. But what Shelley is really responding to here is Peacock's claim, which was probably only half serious to begin with, that poetry is in decline at present because it is not relevant to contemporary society. In earlier times, he said, the poet had an important place in society, but in this modern industrialized age, this is no longer the case. As a result, Peacock argues poetry is a waste of time and we should devote ourselves to more practical pursuits. And in this, Peacock is anticipating the Victorian era with its demands for usefulness. But Shelley is still thoroughly romantic and takes it upon himself to refute this claim of the uselessness of poetry. Although, as I said, Peacock was not being entirely serious when writing The Four Ages of Poetry. It was kind of written as a sort of provocation. And he was a close friend of Shelley's, so this might lead us to rethink the tone of Shelley's work somewhat. He comes off as being argumentative to a certain degree, but he doesn't have an entirely serious opponent in the essay he's refuting. Shelley's answer to this utilitarian logic is that while reason, he says, is the enumeration of quantities already known, imagination is the perception of the values of those quantities. Thus, he says, reason is to imagination as the instrument is to the agent, as the body is to the spirit, as the shadow to the substance. So reason, Shelley claims, is not primary. It's only valuable insofar as it enables the functioning of the imagination. Now, this distinction between reason and imagination should recall Coleridge's distinction between fancy and imagination. In both cases, Shelley and Coleridge privilege imagination and relegate what they call fancy or reason to this merely mechanical function of the working of the human mind. For both of them, it's only the imagination that has the capacity for genuine originality and creativity. In the first page, Shelley uses the metaphor of the Aeolian lyre, which is a kind of flute that's played by the wind, like a wind chime, but a wind instrument. And this is something that recurs in Shelley's poetry as well. And the idea here is that the poet is partly the active, is the musical instrument, but is also partly passive, being played by the wind or the force of nature. And this should also recall Wordsworth and Coleridge in their sense of the human mind being part active and part passive. That and the opposition to this idea that we should be entirely active in our mental activity. So despite what we've seen already in Mont Blanc, Shelley in this essay moves a little bit away from Burke's distinction between the sublime and the beautiful. For Burke, objects and phenomena could either be sublime or beautiful, and which one they were is determined by the object itself. For Shelley, on the other hand, the beautiful is the relation between this highest pleasure and its cause. In other words, the determination of the beautiful moves from the external cause to the internal apprehension. As in Mont Blanc, it all depends on how we perceive it. So in a way, we kind of have a collapse of the beautiful and the sublime, in that Shelley's only concerned with the effect and therefore is not so interested in tracing out the distinction between the different causes of pleasure, as Burke was. I'm going to sum up Shelley's essay into 7 key points. Number 1, poetry deals with ideas and not things. The poet for Shelley, as for Wordsworth, is not just somebody who can write rhyming verse. Poetry is a more ideal and, for Shelley, kind of quasi-religious quality. He says a poet participates in the eternal, the infinite, and the one, as far as relates to his conceptions. Time and place and number are not. In other words, the poet deals with ideals and with questions of how the world should be, not how it is. So poetry in the ideal sense cannot get bogged down by these empirical limitations. Point number 2, poetry utilizes the ideal artistic medium, which is language. For Shelley, the signifiers of language are arbitrary, unlike those of other artistic media. They are therefore, for him, the immediate products of the imagination and therefore more easily manipulated by the artist. That is why he claims poetry to be superior to other art forms. He says language is a mirror which reflects, while the painter's paint or the sculptor's stone is a cloud which enfeebles. Contemporary theorists might have something to say about this, in that it ignores the way in which words themselves are still things and not simply transparent media through which ideas are communicated. Like Wordsworth, Shelley opposes the distinction between poetry and prose, but for reasons that are perhaps more philosophical than critical. His point is that all forms of language stand in the same relation to truth. Number 3, poetry is superior to narrative or history in the realist sense of the terms. A story, as Shelley refers to it, only conveys particular events. Poetry is capable of expressing what is universal about those events. So poetry is the artistic shaping of language into a kind of universal unity. Genuine poetry for Shelley is timeless because it doesn't depend on the understanding of a particular historical period. Again, literary critics today might question that and suggest that all literary works are bound to their time period in some way. But Shelley, as is characteristic of Shelley, is being very idealistic. He says, a story is as a mirror which obscures and distorts that which should be beautiful. Poetry is a mirror which makes beautiful that which is distorted. Shelley uses the mirror metaphor throughout this essay, but whereas earlier he says that language is a mirror that reflects reality more clearly than other media, here he says that poetry is a mirror that doesn't simply reflect, but actually does more than that. It also idealizes its subject matter. And we might ask here whether we see a contradiction there, or whether we think that those two roles can be seen as complementary. Number 4, poetry is ethical because it works on the imagination. For Shelley, poetry works through love. Morality depends on, quote, a going out of our own nature and an identification of ourselves with the beautiful which exists in thought, action, or person not our own. Thus, he says, the great instrument of moral good is the imagination, and poetry administers to the effect by acting on the cause. In other words, poetry is not directly ethical, but it enables ethics to be possible. Those poets who have created poetry with an explicitly didactic aim have suffered a diminishing of their effect in proportion to the extent to which they have tried to impose a single moral view. Rather, imagination enables contact with that which is other to ourselves. It enables that imaginative engagement that we saw in a slightly different form earlier in talking about the idea of sensibility. But the main point here for Shelley is that poetry is ethical in an indirect way. That if you try to use poetry to preach, you will be much less effective than if you use it to engage the imagination in a productive way. Number 5, poetry is a spontaneous act of creativity. The most famous passage of this essay is his analogy of where he compares the poetic mind to a fading coal, used to demonstrate that poetry is not an act of the will. It depends on a power which, though it arises from within, is not wholly within our control. Poetry is therefore something that one cannot simply decide to write, nor is it something that one can work hard to perfect. It either comes or it doesn't. And he compares the writing of poetry to the birth of a child, and therefore suggests that it is not analogous to something that is merely built or constructed through hard work. And again, tying in with Coleridge's image of organic creativity, that a poem is born and not constructed. And there's also an obvious analogy here to Wordsworth's conception of poetry as spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. Both writers agree that poetry is something spontaneous that happens through the power of the mind, not something that happens because of a conscious decision made by the human mind. Number 6, poetry defamiliarizes the world. Poetry, Shelley says, strips the veil of familiarity from the world, thus suggesting both that it presents things as other to us, and that this otherness is in some way what is real. In Shelley's very Platonic terms, what is beyond the veil. He ambiguously says that whether poetry, quote, spreads its own figured curtain or withdraws life's dark veil from before the scene of things, it equally creates for us a being within our being. This implies that poetry can either create a veil or withdraw life's veil, or that it necessarily does both at all times. It is interesting here to note the two alternatives, though. Is art a curtain that interposes itself between reality and our vision, or is poetry that which withdraws the thing that obscures our ability to see reality in the first place? Either way, the effect is to produce in us a sense of wonder that is obscured in our everyday experience. As a result of this contact with what is other, poetry embodies less the spirit of the individual poet and more the spirit of the age speaking through the poet. Shelley ends with the most famous claim of this essay, that poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world, which is in some ways the logical conclusion of his earlier description of the way in which the poetry of an age is of a quality directly correlated to its social health. But as is the case throughout this essay, the indirect nature of this influence is crucial. Poets are unacknowledged, partly because the utilitarians refuse to acknowledge the importance of poetry. Utilitarians like Peacock pretends to be focusing only on usefulness, but partly also because poetry could not have a directly acknowledged effect. Just as poetry is only ethical insofar as it is not didactic, it is political only insofar as it does not try to be directly political. Poetry changes the world in subtle and indirect ways, not through any attempt to convince of a particular political dogma. So that point about the indirect effect of poetry is essentially the crucial point that Shelley wants to make about the value of poetry to the society in which it lives. It's something that activates our imagination rather than telling us how we should think.